So eggless macarons have been on my to-bake list for the longest time now, all thanks to you guys. I'm excited to be finally making them on my channel. Let's do this. Before we get into the recipe, let me take you through the ingredients that you need to make eggless macarons. The first thing you need is aquafaba, which is basically a thick, almost gelatinous chickpea water. You could also make it at home. I'll leave the process for that in the description box below. But what I would recommend is getting a store-bought can of chickpeas and using the water from this because this is more foolproof and gives an efficient result. The next thing that you need is sugar. We'll be using two types of sugar for this recipe. Caster sugar, which is also called breakfast sugar or superfine sugar, and we also need icing sugar, which is your pisi huई chini. If you want to give your macaron shell some color, you also need edible food color. I would recommend you use the gel ones over liquid ones because that might change the consistency of your macaron batter. The last thing that you need is almond flour. This is again something that you can make at home. I leave the process for that in the description box below. For my macarons, I like using store-bought almond flour because A, it's more finely ground, and B, the almond flour that you make at home might have a higher moisture content, which may lead the macaron shells to crack. Since both almond flour and icing sugar tend to have a lot of lumps, the first thing that we need to do is to sift them in a bowl, which would give us a smoother shell. The next thing that we need to do is to whip up the aquafaba. As most of you would know, traditionally macarons are made with the meringue using egg whites, but since this is an egg-free version, we'll be using aquafaba instead, which has similar properties and whips up beautifully. What I'm going to do now is pour my aquafaba into a clean, grease-free bowl, and using my electric mixer, I'll beat it at medium speed. After beating for a couple of minutes, as you can see, the aquafaba will begin to become foamy. This is when I am going to increase the speed of my mixer to high and start adding caster sugar. I am going to add the sugar into the aquafaba in 3 batches and I'll mix well after each addition. So it's been about 7 to 8 minutes. Now as you can see, the aquafaba has formed soft peaks. You do not have to stop here. You need to keep beating and keep mixing until it forms stiff peaks. Also, just a heads up, the aquafaba is going to take much longer as compared to egg whites. So be patient and keep mixing. The best way to check if your aquafaba is done or not is to turn the bowl upside down over your head, and if your hair is still clean, it means you're good to go. Once my aquafaba has formed stiff peaks, I'll add in a few drops of the gel food color. The shade that I'm using here is Baker's Rose, and then I'll mix it in as well. This is where I'll ditch my electric mixer and use a spatula to fold the dry mix in. This is where you need to be extremely careful. If you overmix at this stage, you'll end up with the batter which is too runny and macarons with no feet. After your dry ingredients have been incorporated properly, start checking the consistency of your batter after each stroke of cut and fold, and stop once the batter begins to freely fall off the spatula, almost like a brownie batter. So my batter looks good. I'll transfer it into a piping bag attached with a small round tip. Once you've transferred the batter into the piping bag, make sure to push the macaron batter, applying pressure on one end to ensure there are no air bubbles in your macaron shells. And pipe it onto a baking tray lined with a silicone mat. If you don't have a silicone mat, you could also use 2 layers of parchment paper. One very important thing to keep in mind here is to ensure that your silicone mat is completely clean and grease-free. One hack that really helps here is to rub a lemon wedge onto the surface of the silicone mat that helps you cut the grease. Now with my piping bag at a 90-degree angle, I am going to apply consistent amount of pressure from the hand on top and pipe macaron shells of the same size. Another thing that we need to do here is to tap the baking tray on the kitchen counter so as to get rid of any air bubbles that might exist in the macaron shells. If you still see any air bubbles on top, all you need to do is to pop them using a toothpick. Alright, so I've piped my macarons. Now what I'm going to do is I let them sit on the counter for about 10 to 15 minutes. The idea is to let them form a film on top, which means that when I touch them, the batter shouldn't stick to my finger. Once the film gets formed, I'll bake them at 140 degrees Celsius for about 30 to 35 minutes. My macaron shells are out of the oven and they have the perfect macaron feed that I was looking for. Now once the shells have cooled completely, you can start filling them with a filling of your choice. I'll be using chocolate ganache around the edges and filling the center with caramel. Ideally, after filling your macarons, you should put them in the freezer overnight, but I can't wait to dig in, so I'm going to take a bite. So good. Macarons are slightly complicated to make and call for a little patience and practice. But if you're up for the challenge, I promise you, you definitely enjoy making and of course eating them. So I can't wait to see your macaron creations. Don't forget to tag me on them at Shivesh17 on Instagram, and I promise to keep coming back to you with new recipes. Until then, happy baking and take care.